She met Sebastian's eyes and gave the smallest nod, the kind that sealed a pact with herself. He offered his arm as if to a partner, not a performance, and she accepted. For a handful of breaths, she rode on that impossible, bright relief at being seen as if she belonged. If you're listening now, tell me where you are watching from in the comments, and please like and subscribe so this story reaches more people. The next ripple moved through the room like a thrown pebble. Whispers threaded between the tables. They used to know each other? Isn't he? And the tone changed from casual curiosity to a sharp, electric interest. Patricia Devon's expression was a sculpture of control cracking along the cheek. She rose slowly, as if from a chair that had been glued by habit. Her hand hovered at the back of her neck in the way people do when they try to arrange the world into something that makes sense. "You shouldn't be here," Patricia said, but it was not a private sentence. It was a proclamation that expected allies. People watched, wanting the moment to replay into a neat moral, the uninvited guest exposed, the scandal extinguished. Bryce moved then, not toward his mother, whose posture held the long trained sweep of social combat, but toward Mabel, as if the presence of the man beside her had reconfigured a map he had long been looking at without understanding. He stopped a respectful pace away, hands in the pockets of his suit jacket, the stiffness of a son still learning how to be at the edge of a mother's world. Sebastian stood gently. "Patricia," he said, the name even and polite. "I hope you'll find this evening as kind as you intend." The exchange could have been a saucer of water on the surface of the party, but under it the currents were strong. Patricia's eyes narrowed in ways practiced and political. "Sebastian," she said, "this is a private celebration." "And yet we are all here," he replied, and his voice had that other thing, a steadiness that suggested a life used to transactions where words were instruments. He had a manner as if he stepped into rooms to rearrange light, not to cause spectacle. Later that night, after the banquet, after the music had folded into a soft jazz and the guests had departed in pairs and clusters, Mabel sat on the stone edge of the garden near the estate's pond. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wet gravel, and the moon had spilled its long, thin coin across the water. Harold's absence was not a new ache, but a companion that had found different forms of presence in her life. The empty chair at breakfast, the way one hand reached for a jacket and found only air. She touched the ribbon on her hat where she had pinned that sprig and let the memory carry her, like someone hums an old hymn because the notes feel like a hand on the shoulder. Sebastian found her there with the same quiet that had characterized the opening scene. He did not sit too close. He respected the space intimacy needs, like a gardener who waits for a plant to lean. "You held your head well," he said. Mabel laughed once, a small, surprised sound. "I was aware of my hat." "You were more than your hat," Sebastian said. "You were a presence that made people uncomfortable with their attention." She regarded him. There was a gravity about him she found both shielding and precise. "You surprised them," she said. "I thought it would be kinder to surprise you," he replied. Not everyone at that table would call the word kindness to mind. They spoke then of small things, of the lights on Michigan Avenue in autumn, of the lake's depth, not in the literal, but as a kind of patience. He asked about Harold with a softness that made even the word manageable. When she said his name, it was like allowing a bell to sound again. "You taught," Sebastian said, remembering. You always had that look of someone unwilling to be hurried when someone else needed to understand. Her throat tightened. I lost my lesson plan when I lost Harold, she admitted. Sometimes I feel as if all my syllabi have been folded into his coat pocket. He nodded. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Sebastian leaned forward slightly. "There's been talk tonight," he said, "and not the kind that will keep you safe." Mabel's shoulders went a little higher. She had learned in the years after Harold the kinds of insult that do not bruise like fingers, but like reputations. Public slights, whispers about dependency and age, the thin assumption that grief makes one small and therefore easier to move aside. She had felt those things before. They never hurt in the same place twice. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying I will not be the one to watch you taken in by these currents," Sebastian said. "I have some control where it will help, colleagues who pay attention, some legal friends who know the language of reputation and obligation, and, more practically, a firm that can make them honor commitments rather than hush them. I thought you might want that." Mabel considered the offer. The world had trained her to see assistance as charity or humiliation. Rarely did it present itself as a return of owed dignity. To accept help, she had to trust that it was not a performance of pity. "What do you want in return?" she asked, not as a cynic, but as someone who had lived enough to know that offers always came with the shape of exchange. "Nothing," he said simply, "except that you be frank about what you want and that you let me help." The next 3 days collected themselves into a small sequence of decisive moments. A check arrived, not from Patricia, but from someone at the Devons office, an envelope that suggested a purchased piece. Mabel did not open it at once. She sat with it on her dining table while the kettle sang. The city outside made sound in its practical, indifferent ways. A bus door sighing on Michigan Avenue, a dog barking somewhere across the block. She remembered Harold's hands, which had been steady because they mapped things into use rather than opinion. She had taught children to read the world with patience, to deconstruct a sentence until it yielded its meaning. Now she had to read an envelope. Bryce came by that afternoon. He had pulled off his tie and rolled up his sleeves. He looked as if he wanted to take his hands off the table and fold them into something that could be trusted. He avoided discussing the check. The first words that came from him were clumsy and honest. "Mom, they said it was easier if you took it, that they'd keep things from getting awkward." Mabel watched him. He had been raised both in her kitchen and in rooms like the hall that had hosted his wedding, between two dialects. "Did you want them to pay you?" she asked. Bryce flinched. "No, it's not that. I just didn't know how to stop it." "There's a difference between stopping it and pretending it's not happening," she said. Her voice was quiet and not at all the same as the small fury that had whispered in the hall. "I don't want to be someone they can buy to maintain a picture. If someone makes space for me now, it needs to be because they respect me, not because they prefer the arrangement." He looked at her in a new way, as if a map he had been using to navigate life had been replaced with clearer printing. "What do you want, then?" "An apology that means something," she said. "Not the kind that comes with a check and a hush clause. A public recognition that the way I was treated was wrong, and Something that will make sure no other teacher in this town gets pushed to the margins when a family chooses optics over people. He rubbed his forehead. That's a lot. It is what dignity asks for, she answered. Not vengeance, not ruin, just what sets the balance right. That evening, Sebastian arrived with papers and a calm that might have seemed theatrical in anyone else, but not in him. He had the sort of reserve that makes people believe there is a plan without being told its particulars. With him was Nora Patel, an attorney with a precise voice and folding hands that spoke of a career spent ordering chaos into contractual legibility. Nora met Mabel in the kitchen, where the light from the street lamp came down in a sober column. She did not mince language. There are several ways to approach this, she said. One is to accept the check and let things become a quiet settlement. No publicity, certain legal releases signed. Another is to insist on terms that create public clarity. An apology at a public event, the establishment of a scholarship or reading corner in your name, and a clause that commits the Devons Foundation to a diversity and dignity training program. The latter is harder. It involves reputational leverage, but it gives other people protection. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Mabel felt the map of the town unroll beneath her feet. She inhaled the smell of lavender from the pot on the windowsill and the faint scent of lasagna left from the night before, and she thought about classrooms and the small acts that build a life. A teacher's consistent eye, a parent who applauds, a community that honors elders. If I ask for that, she said slowly, will they do it? Nora's answer was pragmatic. They will if the choice is reputation or litigation. We can frame it as ethics first, an agreement signed with witnessing parties and a scheduled public statement. We will set a deadline, 72 hours from when they receive the proposal, to accept, or we will proceed with publication to the city press with the evidence of their attempt to hush the matter. Sebastian added, and there will be standard civility, no humiliation. We want to make them better, not punish in a way that becomes spectacle. Mabel sat very still. The shape of justice Nora described was a slow, precise instrument, not a hammer, but a lever that could move things into balance. It appealed to the teacher in her that remembers the logistics of fairness, clear rules, consistent application. 72 hours, she repeated. The number sat in the kitchen light like a small clock. Nora nodded. It gives them a choice. It gives you a public avenue. Bryce watched the exchange from the doorway. He had been willing, perhaps, to let his mother take the check and carry the small shame like a private cloth. Seeing Sebastian and Nora unfold a path that used rules rather than resentment, he stepped forward. If you do that, he said, feeling his words as if they were new tools, I'll stand with you. Mabel felt a fierce tenderness at the sound of his voice. He had made mistakes. He had sat in the shadow of ambition and not always seen the things his mother needed. But tenderness is not the same as absolution. It is an offering that must be accepted. Then we will write the proposal, Nora said. We will ask for the apology to be made at the fundraiser next weekend, under the foundation's banner. We will ask for the scholarship to be set up by the end of the year, and for an ethics disclosure for any of their offices that have sway over educational partnerships. It will be public, Mabel. It will not be humiliating for you. It will be an honoring. That night, Mabel slept with the lavender sprig tucked under her pillow. She dreamt of a small classroom where a boy raised his hand and was called on, where an older woman was not a footnote but a sentence. She woke with a resolve that felt like the first page of a lesson plan. Dignity required actions as well as words. The morning the proposal went to the Devons, the city had a hard, clear light. Lake Michigan lay like a silver promise beyond the avenue. Messages began to circulate in the social circles where reputation traveled fastest. Patricia Devon called with a voice that was smooth as if carved from marble. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Voice that was smooth as if carved from marble. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She offered to meet. She offered to talk privately. She left an envelope at Mabel's postal box that afternoon too deliberate to be accidental. A pale check with numbers meant to seal. The sight of it made Mabel's palms go cool. Sebastian and Nora drafted the letter with the precision of people who knew how words could be used to both liberate and enclose. It asked for a public apology to be made at the Devons' annual fundraiser, for a scholarship fund to be established in Mabel's name, for an ethics clause to be instituted in relevant offices, and for a public release acknowledging the humiliation she had endured that night. It offered a 72-hour window. On the last day of the deadline, the city hummed in the way cities do just before something true moves into the open. Mabel sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea that steamed quietly, and the lavender on her windowsill caught the light and seemed to breathe in the room like a small living thing that had waited. Bryce stood beside her, not speaking. Sebastian watched the clock as if time were a chessboard. Nora had placed the signed proposal on the table and left them to it, to the human work of choosing the stance one takes when dignity demands exchange. Mabel thought of Harold, of classrooms, of the small daily courage of leaning into life after grief. She felt the steadying presence of history, not as a weight, but as something that crystallized choices into meaning. The phone on the kitchen counter vibrated. A message from Patricia blinked across the screen. We will respond tomorrow. For a second, the world hung. Then the clock tripped over into the next day, and the silence was full of the possibility of public reckoning. The ripple that had begun with a man in a black suit at a wedding had widened into a plan that could change more than one table's arrangement. There were other, quieter consequences as the 72 hours became hours in which the town had to pay attention. An assistant at the Devons' office called Bryce with a voice that was practiced. "This is delicate," she said. "We will make a statement that will satisfy both parties." Bryce replied and surprised himself by the firmness in his own words. Mabel stepped outside that afternoon, walked to the stone edge of the small park at the corner, and looked across to where the lake spread its steady surface. Light cut across the water and shattered into small, promising fragments. She thought of returns, not as reversals, but as the patient process of setting right what had been twisted by assumptions. She thought of a classroom where a teacher returns a graded paper with comments that guide rather than condemn. When the call finally came, it arrived in the way news arrives now: short, formal, electric. Patricia's assistant read a prepared line, and then there was an invitation for Patricia to speak at the fundraiser. The words were courteous, fragile as lace. Isir, the words were courteous, fragile as lace. It was not yet the apology Mabel wanted. It was a platform, but platforms are where words become deeds. Mabel felt unexpectedly a small smile settle like sun on her face. Sebastian squeezed her hand. "You will not be alone," he said. No matter what followed, the last row seat had become a vantage point from which a woman could choose to move forward rather than only endure. The black suit that seated itself that night had been both a shock and a key. Sudden attention can be disruptive, but it can also be the necessary disturbance that reveals where balance was lost. 3 days still remained before the public statement, and in those days, Mabel would discover that dignity is not a single act, but a sequence of choices, a lesson plan that stretches longer than one disagreement. She would also learn, in the slow work of conversation with her son and with those who had slighted her, that forgiveness was not an instant, but a curriculum. As the town prepared to watch what would happen at the fundraiser, small scenes continued to accumulate. Bryce visiting the school where his mother had taught, speaking with a principal about resources. Sebastian convening a meeting with his colleagues to ensure the scholarship fund would be administered fairly. Nora preparing the clause that would prevent hush agreements masquerading as settlements. The motifs of that first night continued to show themselves in quiet ways. The lavender on the windowsill, the reflection of light on glass, a photograph of Harold and Mabel under a silver frame. And somewhere between the preparation and the public statement, Mabel found herself rehearsing a speech. Not for media, not for the cameras that would be there, but for the small, stern woman she had always been when called upon to set a classroom right. She wanted her words to be measured, not theatrical, to demand an ethic rather than to shame. On the morning of the fundraiser, the air had the brittle clarity of a winter sun pretending to be spring. The foundation's hall was full. The Devons moved like a family long accustomed to occupying the center of things. Patricia wore a gown that had a river of light sewn down its side. She carried herself as if she had never wavered. When she stepped to the podium, there was a collective intake of breath. The room settled as if listening to the weather change. Patricia's statement began in a way that sounded rehearsed, then gathered a tremor that made the sound real. "We are here tonight to celebrate," she began, and then she said Mabel's name. The words that followed were not immediately the apology Mabel had been offered. They were a circuitous approach, the way people try to land themselves in a more comfortable truth. But as Patricia continued, the edge of her voice softened. "They walked along the lake when the light bent in clear angles, and he would pause to point out a particular way the water caught the sun. She noticed with a teacher's delight that he was good at listening to small things. Mabel planned small trips, short stays at a lakeside inn, afternoons at a museum where she had not gone since Harold's passing. She taught a part-time adult literacy class to people whose lives had been interrupted. The students gave her a steady sense of purpose. In the evening, she sat with a cup of tea and an open window and let the lavender smell that had become so much a part of her settle around her shoulders like a shawl. Forgiveness, she learned, was a slow curriculum. It required boundaries, words, and time. It was not a single speech, but a series of actions that made restitution practical. The scholarship helped a dozen children in its first year. The ethics training dislodged a few assumptions in the Devons offices. Bryce began to call more often, to ask questions that had once shown up as complaints. The town's appetite for drama diminished, as towns' appetites do, and what remained was quieter and more valuable, a rearranged set of expectations. Mabel no longer sat on the last row of parties she attended. Sometimes she elected to be at the front merely because she wanted to be near the music. She kept the lavender on her hat when she went out, as a marker of the life she had reclaimed and as a small resistance to the insinuation that older women are less than. Months later, at a small ribbon cutting where the new reading corner bore her name, Mabel stood at a lectern with a voice that had learned to be both tender and exact. She did not speak in grand absolutes. She spoke of being seen, of the obligation communities have to protect dignity, and of how small acts, an attentive teacher, a respectful chair at a table, add up to culture. People listened, including Bryce, who held his mother's hand under the lectern like a boy and a man at once. After the ceremony, as sunlight slanted through the library windows, Sebastian leaned against a shelf and watched her with the kind of look that had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with admiration. She caught his eye and, with a little defiant grin, plucked a sprig of lavender from the boutonniere she'd worn that day and handed it to him. "Keep it," she said, "not because you need proof, but because sometimes small things remind us of the better parts of ourselves." He accepted it, and for a moment, the world reduced to something manageable and true, the soft exchange of two people who had learned how to respond to life with patience, mercy, and insistence on dignity. There remained no tidy ending where every wound vanished. The Devons learned accountability slowly and with discomfort. Some friendships frayed, and some grew in unexpected ways. Mabel still missed Harold in ways that had no substitute. Yet she had reclaimed her posture at the table of life. The shocking guest in black had changed everything, not by making a scene, but by providing the chance for a woman to reclaim her voice, for a community to set a clearer standard, and for a son to find his way back into the difficult, ordinary work of honor. And when, months later, she and Sebastian sat by the lake watching the sun break the surface into scattered sparks, Mabel felt something like gratitude, quiet, luminous, and entirely earned. She had been moved from the last row to a place where she could both teach and learn once more, where dignity was not a concession, but a way of being that one practiced each day. The city breathed around them. The water held the light. She thought of classrooms yet to come, of hands raised, of a scholarship that might one day be the reason a child read their first sentence. It was not an end, but the beginning of steady work that honors the small human promises we make to each other. The last small note was practical and fitting. Patricia had written a letter to the school board acknowledging the errors of that evening and pledging continued support. Camille volunteered at the reading corner twice a month, awkwardly but persistently. Bryce and Mabel went to a concert together, laughing at the program notes. Nora visited with updates and always a businesslike smile that told Mabel she had done well to trust her. At home, Mabel hung a new photograph on the wall of the library ribbon cutting, of children smiling, of the lavender on the table. Harold's fame remained where it had always been, and she kept a small folded note inside it, a habit that felt like conversation. The life she led was neither perfect nor theatrical. It was simple, stubborn, and honest. She had been humbled that night at the wedding and had reclaimed that humility, turned it into dignity. That reclamation, more than any apology, was the real change. The black suit was the initial shock. What changed everything was the work that followed. The insistence on repair, not revenge. On public truth, not private hush. On community structures that protect the quiet dignity of lives that otherwise would be arranged at the back of the room. Weeks later, when she found Sebastian in the garden trimming a sprig of lavender, she joined him with a small pair of scissors. Together, they cultivated the plant, watching how the stems bent and grew toward the light, a domestic, patient metaphor for the work of living well. The story, if it could be called that, did not end with a single proclamation, but with the day-by-day tending of things that matter. Classrooms that welcomed elders as well as children, fundraisers that prioritized integrity as well as glamour, a son who no longer thought the easiest route was silence, and a woman who knew that her life, arranged justly, could still be full of unexpected company. Later, as the scholarship fund distributed its first bursary to a student whose family needed help buying books and winter coats, Sophia stood nearby in the crowd and watched with a shy, steady light in her face. The scholarship existed, the archives reported, because a community had decided to honor the steady labor of one life by making space for another. The scholarship itself had been a subject of debate. Naming it after Harold had been Mabel's idea, and at first she had thought of it as a secret she would keep to herself, a quiet way to let his habit of collecting second-hand books, of insisting on proper grammar, continue to do good. When she brought the suggestion to the school board, simple, practical, and accompanied by a note from Patricia admitting her earlier mistake and promising funds, the room responded with a round of practical questions and at the end, a small, unanimous assent. Mabel felt the very ordinary embarrassment of someone offered thanks for work that she had done because she loved doing it. She accepted the plaque with a hand that trembled slightly and read the inscription in a voice steady with a modest pride. The plaque read, "In memory of Harold Devon, for the study of quiet things." The wording made people smile because it was exactly the sort of phrasing Harold would have liked, precise, a little eccentric, and kind. At the unveiling, a number of people spoke. Some gave speeches that glittered with rhetoric, and others offered food in baskets and very practical donations. Patricia, who had learned to be brief and sincere, stepped to the microphone and said simply, "I was wrong. I can do better." The statement was small, public, and enough. People applauded because applause acknowledges a human shift. There were moments of friction, of course. Not every apology healed. Some in the town resented the energy spent on the school when potholes remained unfilled, and the bridge at the edge of Main Street leaked in a storm. A few old friends of the Devons found it hard to watch the new arrangements and to understand that the change felt like erasure. Mabel received a letter from an estranged relative that upbraided her for accepting praise. Harold would not have wanted that, the writer insisted. She preserved the letter with the others, folded in the same drawer where the small note to Harold lived. The drawer had become a repository of contradictory truths. Hospitality cards, printed programs from concerts, a ticket stub from the recital where she had last heard Harold laugh. She held the contradictions like careful stitches. Sebastian's presence softened some of the harder edges. He did not try to solve what could not be solved. He preferred to do what was possible. He accompanied Mabel to the library meetings and sat at the edge of the crowd during performances, applauding in the same thoughtful way he treated his plants, gentle, economical gestures of support. In late autumn, they took to trimming the lavender together with a rhythm that needed no talk. They clipped, tied, and planted little bundles that would dry for a winter of tea and memory. One evening, after a day that had included a committee meeting and a child's successful reading test, they sat on the library steps with a thermos and 2 cups. The air was clear and brittle. A flock of starlings wheeled above the trees. "You were nervous today," Sebastian said, watching her hands in which the lavender had dried into a small, fragrant mass. "I was," she admitted. "It is strange, this, to be recognized and not feel like the center, to be chosen to speak for a man and not need the stage. It unbalances me in a good way." He pressed the quasi-ceremonial sprig into her palm. "It unbalances you toward the right things," he said. They both laughed then, quietly pleased. There was no rush. They cultivated a companionship that allowed for both laughter and for absences of conversation, comfortably companionable silences that resemble steady work. At the heart of the neighborhood, the library's reading corner became more than a nook. It was a place where elders sat with children in a way that felt newly permitted. A retired carpenter, whose hands trembled when he held chopsticks, found pleasure in building simple wooden bookmarks for the kids. A woman who had once been a geometry teacher offered an after-school club on the shapes of stories, how plot points fit together like measured angles. Fundraisers were reimagined so that they favored local artisans and thrifted items over glossy commercial displays. The gala that had once been all crystal and satin became an evening built of soup and pies and auctioned promises of reading lessons. The town found ways to make dignity inexpensive and accessible. Mabel found herself called upon to speak on a panel about honoring elders in schools. She was not interested in platform, but she was interested in the practice of listening. Her remarks were brief. She spoke of chairs, literal chairs in classrooms, and the invisible chairs we assign to people in our towns. She asked that no one be relegated by habit to the last row. "We arrange our rooms," she told the audience, "but more importantly, we arrange our habits toward one another. That is the craft we practice." Her voice, understated, carried because she said what she needed to say, without sermon, without flourish. There were private repairs to do as well. Nora's businesslike ways had not been smoothed into sentiment. She remained competent, efficient, and at times painfully direct. But she visited with updates that were more than business transactions. Notes on grant applications, lists of donors, small personal acknowledgments of Mabel's choices. Once, standing in Mabel's kitchen between the coffee pot and the sink, Nora placed a compact velvet box upon the table. "For Hannah," she said, without explanation. Mabel opened the box to find a small brooch in a shape that resembled a sprig of lavender. It was antique, perhaps, and perfectly imperfect, slightly bent and full of fingerprints. "This belonged to a woman who taught music to my mother," Nora explained. "She kept it on the piano. She would have thought this a reasonable way to continue a friend's memory." Mabel slid the brooch into her cardigan pocket and felt an odd warmth, as if a judgment she had feared had been softened by a stranger who understood the fit between memory and daily act. There were still nights when sorrow came like a weather front, sudden, thorough. In those hours, Mabel would return to the old habit she kept with Harold's photograph. She would fold a note, sometimes with a single sentence, "I taught Sophia how to read today," and place it inside the frame. Once she left a tiny dried lavender sprig there as well, tucking it behind the glassed face. It felt absurdly like conversation. It was not denial. It was a way to keep a relationship alive in a manner that respected both absence and presence. That winter, the community organized a small ceremony to recognize the first cohort of scholarship recipients. The town hall smelled of citrus and old varnish. Children's drawings lined the walls. Mabel stood at the back, hands folded over one another, and watched Patricia and Camille and a number of volunteers shepherd the evening. The mayor, careful to avoid pomp, offered a short toast to practical kindness. One by one, the scholarship students stepped forward to receive their certificates. They were nervous, proud, relieved. A mother in a threadbare coat wept enough for the room to hush. The recipients spoke of plans, gas money for an internship, a bus pass for an after-school program, a stack of books they could finally buy. At the end of the program, someone brought forward a small wooden box. Tied with a simple ribbon, it contained the first book that Harold had given Mabel when they had been newly married. A slim volume of poems, its spine softened by years of handling. The box was a gift to the library, to be kept for young readers who might discover in it the pleasure of language. Mabel took the book, not sure what her hands would do with it. When she lifted the lid, a single sprig of dried lavender fell out, as if it had been waiting there, pressed in paper, for the right season. She opened her mouth because people expected remarks, but what came out was small and direct. She spoke of rooms and chairs and of the simple habit of attending to one another's dignity. She mentioned Harold in a way that made the room feel intimate rather than exposed. A man who loved quiet things and who, in being himself, allowed others room to be themselves. There were a few tears then and some laughter. She stepped down from the stage, and in the corridor outside, a boy who had once been called shy offered her the first page of a story he had written. "For you," he said, which felt like more than a formality. Spring brought new projects. The school organized a mentorship program that paired elderly residents with children for weekly reading. The carpenter continued to make bookmarks. Camille proposed a story writing night in the library's attic that would be particularly for children who like to invent maps and monsters. Patricia, whose public apology had evolved into consistent attendance and quiet checks, announced that she would underwrite a summer literacy camp for 2 years. She did not stand under the spotlight when she made the announcement. She preferred to be at the back, handing out flyers and occasionally showing up at the craft table to glue paper stars to cardboard puppets. Mabel noticed changes in small, cumulative ways. Parents began to leave their own chairs in the reading corner more often. Grandparents returned to the library to look up a recipe or to sit in on a story time. The town's social calendar subtly rearranged itself to accommodate slow things. People who had never before considered volunteering found that they could spare 1 hour or 2, and that those hours accumulated into something sturdy. A year after the black suit had entered the wedding, the library hosted a modest celebration for the donors and the new programs. The air was warm, the light in the windows like poured honey. A photograph was taken that would later be placed on the wall of Mabel's living room. Children smiling, the lavender on the table, the old plaque shining in the background. Harold's frame sat to the side of the mantel as always, and Mabel kept the small folded note inside. Sometimes she changed what she wrote, and sometimes she left it the same. In the photograph, her shoulders looked less set against the world and more open to it. When she returned home from the celebration, tired and gently pleased, she found an envelope on her kitchen table. Inside was a note from Patricia. It read, "Thank you for choosing to do the right thing." And beneath the signature, in a smaller hand, she had added, "I will be there next month at the reading circle. Your presence matters." Mabel folded the note and placed it on top of Harold's photograph before she changed her clothes. She took the dried lavender they had cut in the garden and slipped its stem into the tiny allowance of space behind the photo. The lavender scent rose faint and persistent. It was not a monument, it was a companion. As the sun lowered and the light thinned to a soft blue, she sat with Sebastian on the back steps. They listened to the distant sound of children in a playground, the bright, uncomplicated sounds that made the world legible. In the distance, the library clock chimed, and in the house behind them, the kettle began to sing. They did not make plans that radically altered things. Instead, they spoke of trivialities and of a trip to the bookshop when the weather allowed.
Before going inside, Mabel took up a small pair of scissors and clipped another sprig of lavender. She pressed it briefly to her lips. Then, with the quiet deliberation that had become her habit, she opened Harold's frame and slipped the new sprig beside the old note. The gesture had no headline. It would not be written about. It was, she knew, an ongoing small sacrament, tending, remembering, making room. The work remained unfinished in the largest sense. There were still hard meetings to be had, children who would arrive with troubles that would not evaporate, and a community that needed constant renegotiation of what dignity required. But on that evening, with lavender drying on the mantel and the photograph of the ribbon cutting smiling back at her, Mabel felt that the arc of small decisions had bent subtly and unmistakably toward repair. She went inside with Sebastian and poured tea, and when she turned back to glance at the photograph one more time, she saw how the children's faces lit from within by ordinary promise. She breathed in the faint perfume of lavender and the faint, steadier scent of the life she had chosen to keep. Work, modest and unending, that asked only for patience, honesty, and the refusal to let the last row become permanent. Outside, the town moved, traffic, dog walkers, the distant murmur of a radio, but inside there was a small, relentless calm. Mabel closed the kitchen light, folded the day into the drawer where her notes lived, and took up the small book to set it by the bedside. She was not immune to future surprise, or to the moments when grief would still visit. She had, however, learned how to answer sorrow with the cultivation of ordinary things. Classrooms that welcomed both elders and children, scholarship money that bought books and gloves, friendships that returned like careful letters. There was still work to be done, of course. The lavender would need pruning. The reading corner would eventually require more cushions. A student would one day fail a test and need help finding the courage to try again. But these were proper matters, work for steady hands and open ears, and Mabel rose each morning ready to tend them. She had been moved from the back row into a place where she could both teach and learn, where dignity was practiced rather than declared. She placed the kettle on for one more cup, and as the steam rose, reached once more to the photograph that hung above the mantel. Inside Harold's frame, the note she had kept for months lay folded, and on top of it the lavender sprig, dried and certain, nodded as if in agreement. Mabel traced the edge of the frame with the pad of her thumb, a small benediction for the day's ordinary victories, and then turned the light out. The house exhaled, and somewhere beyond the window a child said a sentence and found themselves able to keep it steady.